Hi, everyone. How's my volume? Good? So this is very exciting. I realized today as I was driving here that I have not spoken live in San Diego since 2019. Isn't that crazy? I mean, I've done so many Zoom programs, but to be in front of actual people and to be able to see your faces and your reactions is very, yes, huzzah. It is good stuff. So I am especially happy to be here with you this morning, and I'm excited to share some of the really pioneering stories of American Jewish women who have worked so hard to get on the Bimah, into our synagogue boardroom, to young men. Kaplan replied, "I have 5 reasons for promoting the celebration of Bat Mitzvah. 4 daughters, and the conviction that it is unethical to deny women an active role in Jewish civilization." Yes. 50 years later, American Jewish women experienced another first on the Bimah when in 1972, the Reform movement ordained Sally Prezant. That was the first female rabbi in America. Today, we recognize the 100th anniversary of the Bat Mitzvah, the 50th anniversary of the first female rabbinic ordination in America, and together celebrate a century of increasing opportunities for our daughters to lead from the Bimah, the boardroom, and the classroom. It's good stuff, right? So these kinds of commemorative anniversaries provide excellent opportunities for reflection and review. Perhaps some of you have participated in the many and varied commemorative activities launched just this year and designed to honor the Bat Mitzvah and the ordination of female rabbis. There have been classes and podcasts and exhibits and Instagram stories. And at the end, when we have Q&A, I welcome you to share any of these experiences that you have participated in. I have put a few of my favorites up there on the slide for you. I recommend them all, and I can speak more about them also after my talk. So there are also a lot of articles that have been published this year. There are books that are going to press about Bat Mitzvah and about women's ordination. These are exciting times for these topics. Now, all of these cultural creations, the Instagram stories and the articles and the books and the exhibits, they are all in their own right exciting, but they are also collectively important because this is how we make history. This is how we make history. The narrative, the story that we tell about the history of the Bat Mitzvah and female ordination is being reshaped right now. Telling these stories is a great responsibility, and it's also, I'm sharing this with you very honestly, an imperfect process. It is impossible to recount every detail, to share every experience. Scholars look at the sources and then we summarize. Anniversaries like the ones that we are observing this year provide excellent opportunities to check in, to make sure that we are getting it right, to review old sources and collect new stories. So today I'm going to share some of the latest scholarship on Bat Mitzvah and ordination with you, new anecdotes, new angles, new ideas that have emerged in this commemorative year. The scholarship on women's ordination and on the Bat Mitzvah so far that's existed up until now has focused, as much of early scholarship on a topic often does, on the pioneering personalities, the firsts. In this case, that's Judith Kaplan, the first bat mitzvah in 1922, and Sally Prezant, the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi in America in 1972. Kaplan and Prezant smashed stained glass ceilings. There is no question that their stories are important, crucial, and inspiring. But these two women did not make changes by themselves. They were not alone. And there's still a lot of work to be done about what each woman did to get to her milestone, and then what happened after she made it there. So today, in our time together, we are going to, oops, slides are sliding around. Today, in our time together, I want to put these pioneers in the context of the larger Jewish women's movement to connect and grow their stories so that you can see how change making isn't a single moment, but rather a longer, more inclusive, more connected journey. So let's start again with Judith Kaplan and follow the new and exciting paths that her story has taken this year. The basics of her bat mitzvah are well known. At the age of 12, Judith Kaplan became the first American to celebrate a bat mitzvah on March 18, 1922. Judith was the oldest daughter of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who, as I shared before, was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. Believing that girls should have the same religious opportunities as their brothers, Rabbi Kaplan arranged for his daughter to read Torah on a Shabbat morning at his newly founded synagogue, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism in New York. Let's pause here for a minute to dig a little deeper into Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan's motivations. Rabbi Kaplan was the first modern Jewish thinker to articulate that Judaism was not just a religion or a culture, but rather was an evolving religious civilization. Kaplan taught that over time and in new places, Jewish tradition had changed, and that when faced with the pressures and demands of modernity, of the need to come to terms with the world of science and reason, Judaism needed to continue to change in order to remain relevant, vibrant, and meaningful to a new generation of Jews. Kaplan also taught that Jews live in two civilizations, the American civilization and our Jewish civilization. Instead of seeing them at odds with one another, Kaplan argued that we can draw wisdom from each to support the other. Considering the context of his philosophy helps us to understand why Rabbi Kaplan would put his daughter Judith forward as the first bat mitzvah. He wanted his new synagogue and his own family to represent modern cutting-edge Judaism. To this end, Rabbi Kaplan was inspired by one of the most modern and cutting-edge movements of his time, the women's suffrage movement. Remember that women's suffrage, the women's right to vote, was ratified with the 19th Amendment in the year 1920. That was just 2 years before Judith's bat mitzvah. That was another anniversary that we celebrated recently, right? Rabbi Kaplan supported the suffrage movement, and he saw his promotion of bat mitzvah as an expansion of his suffrage work, in that it gave girls a voice, if not a vote, in his congregation. So as we celebrate Judith Kaplan, we should also recognize her father, who was the catalyst for her groundbreaking bat mitzvah ceremony 100 years ago. However, even radical Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan had his limits. While Judith did read the Torah at her bat mitzvah in 1922, she did not read the Torah from the Bimah. In fact, she did not read the Torah from the Torah. Instead, she read her Torah portion from a bound Bible while standing at a lectern in front of the Bimah. And I share this detail with you so that you can appreciate that Judith's bat mitzvah, while revolutionary, was not the bat mitzvah that we know today. In fact, the ceremony took some time to catch on and to grow. Few other American congregational rabbis were as bold as Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, who trained all 4 of his daughters to be bat mitzvah. In a 1931 survey of 200 conservative rabbis, Only 6 of the respondents had adopted bat mitzvah in their synagogues, and many had never even heard of it. Among Reform rabbis, confirmation remained the coming-of-age ceremony of choice for both boys and girls. Indeed, it replaced bar mitzvah in some Reform temples until the last quarter of the 20th century. While American congregations were slow to change, Jewish girls found their voices outside of the synagogue, and in this case, I mean literally outside, as in out of doors, at Jewish summer camp. Jewish summer camps operated without the strictures of the synagogue. There were no disapproving board members, no pesky bylaws, no cranky elders at summer camp. Instead, what you found was a youth culture fueled by a sense of freedom and possibility. 2 camps in particular, not coincidentally directed by disciples of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, Camp Sedgwin in the Catskills and Camp Modine in Maine, made bat mitzvah a summer camp tradition. In the great outdoors, where informality reigned, girls were permitted to become bat mitzvah by reading from the Torah scroll during Shabbat morning services. What Mordecai Kaplan and his summer camp disciples failed to anticipate, though, was the next step. And this is an insight from Rabbi Carol Balin, who's writing a book about the history of bat mitzvah. And maybe some of you saw Rabbi Balin when she was in town. She was in San Diego speaking at Beth Israel in March. And what Balin argues is that for Jewish girls in the 1920s and 30s, bat mitzvah was a dead end. Instead of beginning, it being the beginning of their lives as Jewish adults with the full spectrum of rights and responsibilities in the community, bat mitzvah was their one and only experience on or adjacent to the Bimah. Being a daughter of the commandments for one day was great, but what about the rest of her life? These first bat mitzvahs were young. They were not yet teens. They're 12-year-old girls, which made them appear innocent and non-threatening. And in this way, bat mitzvah seemed like a low-risk innovation, right? They were just kids. It wasn't like Kaplan and his cohort were suggesting something really radical, like the idea that women could be, let's say, rabbis. But girls grow up. And these girls grew up having taken that first formative step up to the Bimah, after which they did not want to go sit back down. Instead, they wanted more. They wanted more access to ritual. They wanted more access to the community. They wanted more access to synagogue leadership. In this way, bat mitzvah firsts grew out of the movement for women's suffrage, the vision of Mordecai Kaplan, and the experiential environment of Jewish summer camps to become their own women, women who would, as adults, act as catalysts for expanding participation in American Jewish life. Sally Prezand stands on the shoulders of these bat mitzvah girls. In fact, a couple of them preceded her into rabbinical school. In addition to zooming out to get this kind of more complete picture of the early bat mitzvah experience, the New Anniversary Scholarship pays attention to Prezand's predecessors, placing her ordination in the larger cultural conversation about female rabbis that had been going on in America for almost 100 years before Rabbi Prezand met her milestone. Could not our women be ministers? Asked an article by Jewish journalist and community activist Mary Cohen on the front page of Philadelphia's leading Jewish newspaper, The Exponent, in, wait for it, the year 1889. With her article, Cohen introduced what would become a favorite topic for hypothetical debates among American Jews. Over the next several decades, rabbis and rebbitzins, sisterhood presidents, and seminary professors relished in theoretical discussion of whether or not women could become rabbis. These discussions were theoretical. The debates remained hypothetical as long as no Jewish woman were actually seeking ordination. The debates got real in the 1920s. During the same decade that saw Judith Kaplan and her sisters become Bat Mitzvah, a small number of American Jewish women sought rabbinic ordination for themselves. 4 women, Martha Newmark, Irma Levy-Lindheim, Dora Askowitz, and Helen Hadassah Leventhal, tested the actual boundaries of American Jewish religious leadership by studying to become American rabbis. Martha Newmark was the first of the early female rabbinical candidates. In 1918, she enrolled in the co-ed college preparatory program at Hebrew Union College, the Reform Movement's rabbinical seminary in Cincinnati, Ohio. At Hebrew Union College, she excelled in her study of Bible, Hebrew, Aramaic, rabbinics, liturgy, and Jewish history. In fact, Martha's Hebrew skills were so outstanding, her command of liturgy so impressive, that during her 16th summer at a Michigan summer resort where her father served as the seasonal rabbi, with his endorsement, she led the prayers. The astounded congregants responded mostly favorably, and the experience had a profound impact on Martha herself. She would, she decided, become a rabbi. Do you spot the pattern here? A young woman whose father was a rabbi, who got a taste of Jewish leadership outside of the traditional synagogue in an informal summer setting. This is interesting, right? So much of the change for women in Judaism started with these very young women and their experiences outside of the synagogue. Let's keep this in mind as we continue with Martha Newmark's quest to become a rabbi. In 1921, after completing 3 years of study at Hebrew Union College, Newmark asked to be assigned a pulpit for the High Holy Days. Her exemplary Jewish education and brief taste of spiritual authority had readied her, she felt, to serve one of the small, usually rural American congregations that annually turned to Hebrew Union College for student rabbis to lead Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur services. Her male classmates who wanted to become rabbis made the same request. The faculty assigned pulpits to her male classmates. They created a committee to deal with Newmark. 2 years of discussion and debate on the question of women's ordination followed. The Hebrew Union College faculty, its board of governors, its rabbinic alumni, and their wives and daughters all weighed in on the question of whether women generally, and Martha specifically, might become a rabbi. The tone and substance of these debates, which occurred between 1921 and 1923, tell us a lot about Reform Judaism and gender politics of the time. The majority of the parties involved agreed that theoretically women should become rabbis. Reform Judaism's commitment to women's religious development and the movement's desire to modernize religious experience meant that logically, quote, women cannot justly be denied the privilege of ordination. From a practical standpoint, however, women's ordination presented challenges. First of all, there was a very small but quite loud faction of faculty and board members who opposed female ordination as, quote, absurd and ridiculous and contrary to all Jewish tradition. They argued that unlike Reform's previous moves to alter tradition, which had been, quote, absolutely necessary for the preservation of Judaism, this one represented the mere, quote, whim of 2 or 3 girls with unsuitable ambitions. Furthermore, they contended that female ordination, if permitted to go forward, would create a rift in Reform Judaism between its supporters and detractors and incite outrage from the majority of world Jewry. While arguments about tradition were easily dismissed, the issue of stability in the Reform movement was a source for real concern. In addition, all of the parties involved were worried about the expense. Who would pay for the costly remodeling and replumbing of the dorm? You cannot imagine how many discussions there were about the remodeling and replumbing of the dorm. Would Newmark and other Jewish women be a quote unquote bad investment for the seminary, as they would in the words of one professor, quote, doubtlessly marry and become pregnant and thus be unable to appear in public or perform public functions at various times. At the base of all of these concerns was a balance sheet on which the various factions involved tried to calculate the true cost of allowing women to become rabbis. What would the cost be for their college, for their careers, and for their movement? In the end, the Hebrew Union College Board of Governors determined that the cost of women's ordination was too high. In February 1923, the board, which held ultimate authority over college admissions and graduation, voted 6-2 that the right to matriculate for the purpose of entering the rabbinate should remain limited to male students. Though the board's vote closed off HUC as a women's route to the rabbinate, another avenue for women's ordination opened up at just about the same time. In 1922, Rabbi Stephen Wise, the dynamic founder of New York's Free Synagogue and one of the most charismatic figures in the Reform movement, established the Jewish Institute of Religion, a non-denominational, pro-Zionist seminary in New York. The seminary's first class included 3 women enrolled with the distinct status as their status was, quote, special non-matriculating students. One of these women, Irma Levy-Lindheim, a 33-year-old Zionist activist and mother of 5, petitioned after 2 years of intensive study to change her status to rabbinical candidate. Unsurprisingly, debate ensued among the faculty, who rehashed the same challenges that they had discussed at Hebrew Union College, but came to a different conclusion. The Jewish Institute of Religion's faculty agreed to grant Lindheim's request and to amend the seminary charter to state that it would, quote, train in liberal spirit men and women for the Jewish ministry, research, and community service. A family crisis, however, took Lindheim away from her studies and abroad to Palestine in 1925. She returned a more ardent and committed Zionist and dedicated the rest of her very interesting life to raising funds and awareness for Palestine. She did not return to rabbinical school. Practical challenges also thwarted the rabbinic aspirations of Lindheim's 2 female classmates, Dora Askowitz and Helen Hadassah Leventhal. Askowitz left the Jewish Institute of Religion after 15 years of part-time study, withdrawing in part because her professors continually and creatively discouraged her from continuing. Leventhal completed the entire rabbinic curriculum, but met resistance when it came to ordination. Rabbi Stephen Wise would not permit Leventhal to be ordained with her class because he explained the time was not ripe for the Jewish Institute of Religion to ordain a female rabbi. Thus, in 1939, the Jewish Institute of Religion graduated 10 men who received ordination as rabbis, and Leventhal, who had completed exactly the same program, but who received a master's degree in Hebrew literature. The quests of each of these women to become rabbis in the 1920s and 30s shows us that while the more liberal elements of American Jewry could get comfortable with the theoretical notion of women rabbis, they were not yet prepared for the practical reality of women rabbis. American Judaism was not quite ready to be replumbed. Within the next quarter century, however, this would change. In 1972 in Reform Judaism, in 1974 in Reconstructionist Judaism, in 1985 for Conservative Judaism, the first women received rabbinic ordination. That these women succeeded where those before them had failed reflected the coalescence of several factors in American Jewish life in the second half of the 20th century. Certainly, the long history of the consideration of women's ordination had an impact on these women's experiences and helped to pave the way, especially in Reform Judaism. Of great significance, too, was the new wave of American feminism launched in the 1960s, which included in its agenda equal rights for women, with a special emphasis on equality of women in all professions. Still, the actual entrance of women into the rabbinate depended upon individual women applying, being accepted, and completing rabbinical school, and amassing the community support required for ordination. The first American woman to successfully accomplish these tasks and achieve ordination was Sally Priesand. In 1964, when Sally Priesand crossed the threshold of the Cincinnati campus of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion as a freshman in its undergraduate program, she followed the path of pioneers like Martha Newmark, who had already raised the question of women's ordination in the very same halls. But while the earlier unsuccessful challengers stood largely in isolation, the future Rabbi Priesand found an ever-widening circle of supporters during her tenure on campus, including Hebrew Union College President Nelson Gluck, the national leadership, and thousands of members of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, and many, although not all, of her fellow students. International Jewish papers, as well as the National American Press, also took an interest in Priesand. The media carefully monitored her advancement as a symbol of women's liberation and the inroads it was making in American religion. Both Time and Newsweek wrote pieces about Rabbi Sally's plans to become the first woman ordained in American Judaism. The world was watching Priesand's progress to see if, upon completion of her program, the American Reform movement could move beyond its theoretical acceptance of women's ordination and make Sally Priesand the first actual American woman rabbi. Her successful ordination was by no means a foregone conclusion. Despite this wide base of supporters and fans, Priesand faced numerous obstacles. There were extra administrative hurdles invented by the college. There were congregations that refused the services of a female student rabbi. And there was the professor who asked a fellow student to do the movement a favor and marry her, thus presuming putting an end to her career ambitions. Still, Priesand stayed the course, and by her last year in rabbinical school could say confidently, quote, "It is hard for me to realize that after all of these years, I will finally be ordained. I imagine that there might be some difficulty in finding a congregation. Not everyone will take me, but I don't expect there to be too many difficulties, and I am optimistic." Priesand was ordained amid great fanfare in June of 1972, when Hebrew Union College President Alfred Gottschalk placed his hands upon her head to confer ordination. Priesand's classmates rose to honor the first woman rabbi. In this way, the year 1972 came to stand as a benchmark for gender equality in Judaism. It's this benchmark that we celebrate this year, with the added understanding of the prep work of Priesand's predecessors and a new appreciation that, like with the Bat Mitzvah, the benchmark is just the beginning. In 1972, when Priesand was ordained, American Jewish women still could not be counted as members of a synagogue. They also could not be counted as participants in a minyan, and yet a woman could become a rabbi. So clearly there was a disconnect in American Judaism, and there was still work to be done. The latest scholarship shines a spotlight on a group of young Jewish women who blazed a trail for increased opportunity in Jewish communal life during this period. This group of women called themselves Ezrat Nashim. Founded in 1971 as a small women's study group in New York, Ezrat Nashim was made up of young, well-educated Jewish women, primarily from the conservative movement, who sought to understand and change a woman's place in Judaism. These young women were all part of the New York Havorah. The New York Havorah, founded in 1969, was a counterculture community that aimed to jettison what they saw as bourgeois middle-class values in the suburbs. They wanted to reimagine Judaism as a revolutionary force, working toward liberation, toward greater freedom for the individual and society. And yet, even within this newly fashioned radical Havurah community, there was gendered hierarchy with few opportunities for women to lead. Ezrat Nashim was founded as a group when these women who were part of the New York Havurah decided that they needed to understand better why there was so much pushback to the idea of them being equal participants. So they began to meet and to study the limitations that they faced within Judaism generally and within the Havurah movement more specifically. To this end, they chose a very clever name for themselves, Ezrat Nashim. Ezrat Nashim means assistance for women or help of women, but it also is the name that is often used to refer to the women's gallery in the synagogue. So these young women formed a separate group, both to help themselves and also to get out of the gallery. They are the women's gallery, but they're helping themselves out of it, right? So again, I want you to note here the similarities to our Bat Mitzvah firsts and our rabbinic firsts. These women are young. They're in their late teens and 20s when they form Ezrat Nashim, early 20s, and they're operating once again outside of the traditional Jewish community. They're part of the Havurah movement. They're also making change using a time-honored Jewish tool, learning. The women of Ezrat Nashim spent a year immersed in study and reflection before producing a call for change. Their 1972 manifesto entitled Jewish Women Call for Change demanded that women be counted in the minyan, that women be allowed full participation in religious observances, that women be allowed to initiate divorce proceedings and be counted as witnesses under Jewish law, that women be admitted to rabbinical and cantorial schools, recognizing that many of the traditional restrictions on women's participation in Jewish ritual stem from women's exemption from mitzvot, from the commandments that are incumbent upon men. The document also asked that women be considered bound equally with men in the fulfillment of mitzvot. This was a tall order, and these scrappy young women delivered it with chutzpah. Ezrat Nashim requested permission to appear on the program of the American Conservative Rabbinical Assemblies at their organization's annual meeting in the Catskills in March of 1972. Because this is a group of women trying to understand how to make change. And they think, okay, we've created this document, this call for change. How do we make change? We go to the people in charge, right? And who's in charge of our movement? These conservative rabbis. So they contact the rabbis and they very respectfully ask to be put on the program for 1972. When the Rabbinical Assembly denied them permission to speak, Ezrat Nashim crashed the meeting. Of course they did. They're revolutionaries, right? And they're trained in the 1960s and 70s. You can see on the slide the image of two members of Ezrat Nashim, Leora Fishman and Belle Braun, negotiating with an administrator from the Jewish Theological Seminary about how and when they could speak to the rabbis. That image that you see up there is them actually at the conference saying, we're here, we're not going anywhere, and we want to speak to the rabbis. Instead of giving them the rabbis, the conference leaders offered up an audience with the Rebbitzins. This puts a whole new spin on take my wife, please, right? So the young women of Ezrat Nashim, and they're so young, look at how young they are, met with a group of rabbis' wives. Who, by the way, I took a look at the itinerary for the Rebbitzins at this conference. Their activities included shopping trips, floral arranging, and a fashion show. So I'm thinking they were starved for some intellectual content and very happy to meet with Ezrat Nashim. But Ezrat Nashim was not sure what kind of reception they were going to get from anyone at this conference. One member of the group, Leora Fishman, who was recently interviewed on a podcast, a fantastic podcast run by the Jewish Women's Archive called Can We Talk? I recommend it. We can talk about details of how to listen to it later. Leora Fishman, this member of Ezrat Nashim, remembers that they came into this group of Rebbitzins, they came into this room to meet with this group of Rebbitzins, and they were the women of Ezrat Nashim were cautious, Most of the women in the room were older than them. Some of them, women, were a great deal older than them, and they weren't sure what kind of reception they were going to get. But Leora Fishman said, we spoke, quote, "We spoke to them on a personal, emotional level about what it felt like to be excluded." Another member of Ezrat Nashim who was there that day, Martha Acklesberg, recalled in a recent interview, quote, "What I remember most from that meeting is that toward the end of the conversation, a woman stood up, and in my ageist perspective at the time, I described her to friends as a little old lady. I had no idea who she was. And she said, what I want to know, what I really want to know is where have you been before now?" And it was amazing, said Martha Acklesberg. It was amazing. It turned out that it was Adele Ginsburg, the wife of H.L. Ginsburg, a professor at the seminary, a very famous biblical scholar. And that was amazing for us to have that kind of positive response from someone who was of the older generation, who we thought would be conservative and opposed to change. But it turned out that many of these Rebbitzins were waiting for someone to show up and shake things up. Later that day, at lunchtime, Ezrat Nashim called an open meeting with the rabbis. And Acklesberg estimates that about 100 rabbis showed up. The women of Ezrat Nashim were encouraged by the rabbis' responses. Of course, it was a self-selecting group. Those who chose to come were those who were willing to listen, right? Many of these rabbis promised to take Ezrat Nashim's call for change back to their communities and talk to their congregations about it. Of course, there were also rabbis who voiced opposition to Ezrat Nashim's call for change, arguing that men would rather leave synagogues than give up power. At the end of the day, literally at the end of the day, there was a blizzard. And even though the rabbis and the members of Ezrat Nashim did not see eye to eye on all matters, they agreed that these young women should not drive back to New York because the weather was too bad. So the rabbis, in the end, paid for all of these women to spend the night at the Concord. I'm sure they were just, like the same age as their daughters. So I thought this was kind of a lovely end to the story, especially in today's world, because it shows us how we can disagree and still take care of one another. 1 year later, in 1973, the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Rabbinical Assembly, persuaded by both Ezrat Nashim's call for change and the sweeping support that it received when those rabbis took it back to their congregations, the Rabbinical Assembly acted and ruled that women could be counted in the minyan. At the same time, the Rabbinical Seminary brought back a 1955 minority decision permitting women to receive aliyot, to be called up to the Torah and give the blessing before the Torah. And these two actions together by the conservative movement led to a really marked increase in the number of congregations willing to call women to the Torah, to bring women up to the Bimah. So from 1922 to 1973, from Judith Kaplan to Martha Newmark to Sally Priesand to Ezrat Nashim, we see young American Jewish women making their way to the Bimah. New scholarship in this anniversary year has allowed us to see more of these women, to know more about their journeys, the movements that they belong to, the ideas and the people who inspired them to learn and to lead. The result is a more complete picture and a more nuanced understanding of the process of change for women in Jewish life in America. Now, as a historian, I mostly look backward, but this morning, in light of what we're commemorating, I felt compelled to close with a few comments about the present, to contemplate how Bat Mitzvah and women's ordination have changed contemporary American Jewish life. Bat Mitzvah and the ordination of women have changed our synagogues, our liturgy, our rituals, our theology, and most interestingly to me, our sense of ourselves as a community. A quick run through some of the numbers illustrates the scope of the demographic change to the American Jewish community. Hebrew Union College has graduated more than 600 female rabbis in the 50 years since Priesand's ordination. Today, non-Orthodox seminaries are educating record numbers of women. At the Conservative Jewish Theological Seminary, 40% of the rabbinic students are women. At the Reform Movement's Hebrew Union College, 61% of the rabbinic students are women. At the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, women comprise 68% of the rabbinic student body. And we now have also a seminary for training Orthodox clergy called Maharat in New York. Maharat has trained 50 women to serve as clergy in the Orthodox movement and currently has 50 more in school to become what they call a rabbah, a Jewish clergy member in the Orthodox community. Women rabbis are changing the face of the American rabbinate. What does that mean for us as American Jews? How does it shape our identities and our communities? Well, here's what I think it means. Whenever we look at the Bimah, we see our fathers and our daughters, our mothers and our sons. We see ourselves in our religious leadership, and that is a powerful and compelling reality. It alters our own perception of our role in religion. It gives our children and our grandchildren an unprecedented sense of gender equality, which in my mind broadens their realities and their possibilities. The mere presence of women on the Bimah makes Judaism more accessible, more equitable, and I believe more viable. I want to end today, as I began, with Judith Kaplan. Quote, "No thunder sounded, no lightning struck," recalled Kaplan of her history-making 1922 Bat Mitzvah ceremony. Kaplan stood in front of the Bimah. She led part of the service. She read her Torah portion, and in this way, she began to quietly and competently change our world. Investing Jewish girls and women with religious authority and responsibility may not provoke thunder and lightning, but as we have seen, it does inspire cosmic changes in American Judaism and American Jewish life. Thank you guys for coming today, for taking the time to commemorate these important anniversaries. At this point, I would like to hear from you. Do you have a bat mitzvah story to share? Do you have an empowering summer camp story? Do you have a female rabbi in your family? And of course, I am happy to take your questions. Okay, Hannah, yes, please.
I have some questions, but I have a story. We lived out on Long Island.
Can you speak a little louder, just because we're hear it in this room and then we're gonna hear it, people are at home to hear it too.
We lived on Long Island in the early 50s. And when I got married, we went back. And we joined the synagogue. My father was a founder. My children went to Hebrew day school. If you don't mind, I don't want to take.
You can be on the Bimah, Hannah. That's what we've been working for.
Right. So we were very involved in the synagogue. My children went to the Brandeis Hebrew Day School. They could daven incredibly great. And one came for a bar mitzvah at my cherished synagogue that we founded and we were married in. The rabbi said no. It was heartbreaking because I wanted her bat mitzvah on a Saturday morning and they said no. Therefore, after all those years, we had to leave the synagogue. And of course, a few years later, that changed. But it really took something out of me. And I just felt I wanted to share that. And of course, I had two more daughters that were bat mitzvahs, not at that synagogue. We were out here by then. So that was heartbreaking. I have a question. Where was Sally Percent? Where was her first synagogue?
Thanks for sharing that story, Hannah. One of the amazing things that happened during this commemorative year was that the Jewish Women's Archive, which is a fantastic resource for those of you who don't know it, Their website is jwa.org. They did a Bat Mitzvah project where they have been collecting stories about Bat Mitzvah from Americans. And those stories are so interesting and so compelling. And if you go to their website, you'll be able to read some of them. And many more of them will come out as part of Rabbi Carol Balin's book, which I encourage you to all check out if you're interested in that subject when it's published. It's not published yet. So these kinds of stories that Hannah is sharing are stories that you hear that Rabbi Balin shared from her experience interviewing girls and families about Bat Mitzvah. And I think that we can all relate to Hannah's feeling as a parent feeling so offended for your child. And that helps us to recognize that it's not just the girls, but clearly their parents were on board too with helping them to make this change. We saw that with Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan and his daughter, right? And we see it in Hannah's story. Sally Prezant had a tough time at her first congregation, which I think was a New York congregation, if I'm remembering correctly. She was hired as an associate rabbi and they would not promote her. She then went to the congregation where she spent the next 25 years, which was a smaller congregation in New Jersey where she was the main rabbi. She was the only one and only rabbi. And she's now retired, but she's been on the lecture circuit this year, talking a lot about her experiences. And I just want to point out something really cool to you guys. So one of the really neat projects that is happening this year is an exhibit sponsored by Hebrew Union College. Right now it's at their campus in New York, and then it'll go to Cincinnati. I have not heard of it coming to LA, but I want to keep my eye on it because why would it not come to LA? It's such a cool idea. They took 24 of the early female rabbis. They like the firsts, like Sally is the first, right? And then they are honoring the first queer rabbi and the first rabbi who had a baby while she was, on the pulpit, not literally had a baby on the pulpit, because that would be, a whole other thing, but got pregnant and became a mother while also serving as a rabbi. And they paired them with an artist. And the artist created a work based on that rabbi's life and experiences. And it's really just such a cool project. So this photograph that you see up here is photographed by the famous photographer Joan Roth. And Joan Roth took this photo of Sally Prezant, and this is the photo that appears in the exhibit. And so you can see what she looks like today. But if you're interested, you can see a lot of the pieces of art online. Oh my goodness, let's go this direction to Ron.
I just have a question about how many women rabbis are there in Israel?
Oh, it's such a good question, and I don't know the answer. I do know that, so for example, if you look at the demographics, because I just looked at them yesterday, on women rabbis in the Reform movement, the American women rabbis in the Reform movement are 600, and then there are 100 additional rabbis who are practicing outside of America. I would assume the majority of them are in Israel, although a good number of them might also be in Canada. But I don't know, but let's look it up. That's a great question. Yeah.
Surprised about the women, the Orthodox women who can become rabbah. Are their duties the same as so even so they have a different name or they have a different ending to the A, but the duties are the same then?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I agree. You can see the first rabbah, Sarah Horwitz, up there on stage. She's kind of at one end there next to the moderator. She was at the Hebrew Institute in Riverdale with a very modern, forward-thinking Orthodox rabbi called Avi Weiss in the late, like around 2008, 2009. She was working there just as like a congregational intern, but she had studied. So before that for 3 years at Drisha, which is an institute for the study of Jewish history and law. And she was so learned that together she and Rabbi Weiss decided, maybe she could step up as a clergy person. Like, why was she having this role of intern when she was really so learned and so committed to the congregation? And so they had her study for an additional 5 years. And then he ordained her privately. And they were hesitant. I just listened to an interview with her recently, and you also can listen to an interview with her at the Jewish Women's Archive podcast, Can We Talk? It's really interesting. She was also hesitant about how the congregation would receive her and if they would allow her to perform the same functions that a rabbi might perform, and they did. Now, if that was because they knew her and they, had been with her on this journey, I would think that would be a part of it. But she went on from there then to found this institution, this organization, Maharat, and Maharat is an acronym for all of the duties that a rabbi performs. The pastoral care, the expertise in Jewish law, all of the different things that a rabbi does. And so the expectation is that these women who train there are qualified to do everything that a rabbi does for a congregation. And I'm not going to lie, there are many Orthodox congregations who want nothing to do with them. But there are 50 of these women out there in the world, and 50 more coming up, and some modern Orthodox congregations who have accepted them. So it's a change to keep your eye on. Yeah.
Our daughter, Rabbi Erica Ash, is the president-elect of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. She will become, next year when she takes over, she'll become the 4th woman to lead that organization. I think she'll be the youngest person ever to lead that organization.
Mazel tov, that is wonderful, right? That's so good for everybody in this world and everybody everywhere. That's wonderful. You must be very proud. Yeah.
So when I was young in the 1960s and I went to a few bat mitzvahs, all the girls were 12. Now all the girls are 13. I'm not sure if that is true for all. I'm not sure if there's still some congregations that do. When did that change and why?
So the question is about age of girls at bat mitzvah. It used to be that girls were bat mitzvah when they were 12 and boys were bat mitzvah when they were 13. And that had to do with when the rabbis determined was the age of maturity for a person. That's been, that was an ancient ruling by the rabbis. So I don't think there's been any kind of formal change, certainly not that I'm aware of in any of the movements. But I can tell you from my own personal experience that the synagogue calendar is a very busy thing. And so I think what ends up happening, like at my own personal congregation, which is a gigantic Reform congregation, there aren't enough weekends to accommodate all the kids. So the schedule starts to flex a little bit. And I know also, I'm speaking now anecdotally from personal experience, that there are some kids who they judge are not quite ready at 12 and need a little extra year of maturation or preparation. So I don't think that there's been any formal change, but informally, you're right, there is a more flexible attitude kind of toward when the age is that this particular kid reaches maturity and is ready for this step, and the synagogue calendar can accommodate that child. Yeah, in the back.
I was bat mitzvah May 28th, 1954. 13, and that's the same reason why. The synagogue we belong to, Suffrage Jewish Center in Queens, New York, couldn't accommodate my parents for the date that was actually my birthday.
Yeah.
So I got put off almost the whole year.
Yeah. So that was a comment about getting put off because of the synagogue calendar. Already in the 1950s, the synagogue was so busy, and what a good problem to have, right? So many kids wanting to do this that you can't quite get there at the age of 12 and you end up doing it at 13. Yeah, Deborah.
I was 12 in 1971 in a conservative, very conservative, I think, synagogue. There was no thought of having a bat mitzvah. What I remember the prohibition was, and it might be about the 12 too, is if you had your period, you couldn't touch the Torah or come. And so what is that whole thing? And especially with the Orthodox, like, is that actually a prohibition anyway?
It's certainly, yes, it's an old prohibition in Judaism. And there's actually, Rabbi Carol Balin shares the story of a young woman who at Camp Modin was meant to be the first bat mitzvah in the 1940s. And she woke up with her period, and then they had to cancel the whole thing because they just weren't sure if it was okay. Because of this really long standing association of menstruation with being unclean, right? And you never want to put something that's quote unquote unclean near the Torah. So this is something that's stuck around. I mean, most liberal Jews have moved, I mean, all liberal Jews have moved away from it entirely. But it's a great question for rabbis that are Hurwitz and how they deal with it in an Orthodox congregation. I'm not entirely sure.
Because, I mean, girls have their period at 9 to 10.
Sure, of
anyway,
course.
So.
Yeah, no, there's got to be some, some commentary on that. I haven't read it yet, but
So reform and
Not an
conservative,
issue.
They've gone beyond that
yes,
rule.
yes. They have a very modern, understanding of menstruation as a biological function and not, they don't consider it to be unclean. It's interesting that Deborah says that early 70s.
I was 12 in 71. We had to consecrate, the girls look forward to their consecration. in the grade, and it wasn't during a service either, in the mid 70s. We were on the Bimah, but it wasn't anything with the Torah.
Yes, did you all wear white and
We all
maybe
wore
flowers?
white. I have
Yes.
those pictures. I don't think I would have, I think I might have quit Hebrew school if I had become a Bat Mitzvah. We all stayed
For the confirmation.
for that.
Yes. Now confirmation is a ceremony that was developed originally or became popular originally with the Reform movement. But there were some conservative congregations in America that did eventually adopt it. I think the scholar Paula Hyman found that in American Judaism, Bat Mitzvah was practiced by 50% of liberal congregations by 1950. So you must have been part of the 50% in which it was not practiced. But a full half of them by mid-century were practicing it. And then by the 70s, really after the feminist revolution in the 60s, it was pretty much ubiquitous. So that is surprising. But you were in the early 70s, so maybe they just needed some time to catch up. Yeah, Hannah.
Are you familiar with Lenore Bone's story?
So the question is about Lenore Bohm's
Yeah.
story. Lenore is a wonderful local rabbi and teacher.
She's the first in San Diego.
Oh, the first in San
Yeah.
Diego.
I interviewed her for a book I wrote, and she said when she was a teenager, she knew she wanted to be a rabbi. So she goes to her rabbi, and he says, "Oh, you don't want to be a rabbi. You want to marry a rabbi and become president of sisterhood." And when she went to apply, they turned her down and they thought she was too young. So she had to go for an extra year of special schooling, and they finally allowed her to come.
Yes, that kind of discouragement, not uncommon, but I'll have to talk more with Lenore about that because I would love to know more of her story. All right, I see your hand, please.
Yes, in 1972, when Sally was ordained, was there significant protestations against that?
There wasn't any kind of organized protest, but there were what we would now call like a lot of microaggressions against her. She just had extra hurdles. She had extra trouble getting a job. When she graduated, all of her male classmates had positions and she didn't have one yet. Which actually reminds me of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who I think had the same issue when she graduated from law school. So it was hard for her to get a job, and her first job was a bit of a disaster. And a lot of these early female rabbis talk about this, the challenges. I mean, this is what I mean when I say the benchmark isn't the end, it's just the beginning, right? So you become a rabbi, what's the next step? So you become a bat mitzvah, what's the next step, right? Like, how are you going to move about in the world if not everybody is ready for that change? Or maybe they're ready for it, but they just don't know what it means. So that's very interesting. I heard an interview with one of the first African-American rabbis, a woman, an African-American female rabbi, graduated from the Reconstructionist movement. And she was talking about how people just have weird reactions to you sometimes as a female rabbi. And maybe your daughter has experienced this, where she said, I will conduct a service and then people will come up to me afterwards and say, that was a normal service. And she's like, what did you expect it would be? I'm doing the same job. And one of the things she shared that I thought was so interesting is she said, So one of the problems she thinks we have as American Jews is that if you walk into any American Jewish synagogue, you're going to see somewhere a painting of an old rabbi, an old man with a beard and a kippah holding a tiny little book. And that is not what rabbis look like at all in American Jewish life. And yet that's the image we have hanging up right in our synagogues all over the place. So she was advocating also that we get some new art so people know better how to react. Okay, Lauren is catching my eye. Okay, go ahead.
Now, you asked about, what a rabbi does after she graduates, if she doesn't have a pulpit, or in the 80s, I was working at the Jewish Community Center here in San Diego, and Rabbi Leslie Alexander was working there. I guess she had maybe just gotten out of rabbinical school, and she came to the JCC in the capacity of a staff member working basically with the seniors. But then I guess she ultimately went on to a pulpit, but she had to make that first step and be accepted.
Right, and one of the things I think that female rabbis have done is really expanded what we think of as rabbinical work, because when you have a family, you might not also be able to take on the unbelievable, more than full-time responsibility of being a rabbi. I mean, it's, you're on call 24/7 in many congregations. So one of the things that female rabbis have done is help to change the profession so that it is more manageable. And then they've also taken on other roles in the community, allowing us to really, I think, expand our vision of the kind of work that rabbis do. All right, I think Lauren's giving me the sign, but I'm going to hang around for a few minutes if you want to stay and chat afterwards. It was great to see all of your faces, and it was great that people could join us also virtually. Thank you guys.